A loving father loses his wife and daughter because the justice system chooses a deal over justice. 10 years later, the man they left broken returns with a terrifying plan, one that will expose the flaws of the system and bring everyone responsible to their knees. The movie opens with Clyde, a gifted craftsman who loves working with his hands and is deeply devoted to his family. His young daughter clearly takes after him, and one day she proudly presents him with a bracelet she has made herself. She has even created a matching piece for her mother, turning the moment into a simple but touching glimpse of their happy family life. That peaceful atmosphere disappears almost instantly. Not long afterward, Clyde's wife asks him to answer the front door. The moment he opens it, two men force their way inside. Clyde tries to react, but the intruders overpower him before he can properly defend himself. They beat him down, restrain him, and begin tearing through the house in search of anything valuable. One of the attackers, Darby, is clearly the more vicious of the two. As Clyde lies helpless, Darby coldly tells him that some things simply cannot be avoided, almost as though what is happening has already been decided. He then drives a knife into Clyde. The second burglar, Rupert, appears shaken by how far things are going and makes an attempt to leave, but Darby quickly brings him back under control. Clyde remains conscious just long enough to witness something far worse than the robbery itself. Unable to move or protect anyone, he watches as the intruders brutally attack his wife and kill her. His terror becomes even greater when his daughter is also caught in the violence. Clyde can do nothing except struggle against his restraints and desperately try to cry out. Eventually, overwhelmed by his injuries and the horror unfolding in front of him, he loses consciousness. The story then shifts to Nick, an ambitious prosecutor with an impressive conviction record of roughly 96%. He is highly focused on his career and makes it clear to his team that he does not like taking cases that could damage that record. If a prosecution looks too uncertain, Nick would rather avoid the risk than suffer a public defeat. Soon afterward, one of his colleagues pulls him aside to discuss Clyde's case. The news is not good. A judge has ruled that important DNA evidence collected from the crime scene cannot be used in court. Without that evidence, the prosecution against the two suspects has suddenly become much weaker. Nick immediately begins calculating the chances of winning. Rather than gamble on a trial that could end with both men walking free, he decides to negotiate a plea agreement. He describes the situation as another example of a justice system that is far from perfect, but from his perspective, securing at least one conviction is better than losing everything. When Clyde meets with Nick, he brings along notes and information he believes could help strengthen the prosecution. He still expects the people who destroyed his family to face meaningful consequences. Nick barely considers what Clyde has prepared before delivering the real reason for the meeting. Darby has agreed to testify against Rupert. Under the arrangement, Rupert will be presented as the principal killer and will ultimately receive a death sentence. In exchange for cooperating with prosecutors, Darby will receive a dramatically lighter punishment, potentially serving no more than 5 years in prison. For Clyde, the proposal is almost impossible to process. He has already lost his wife and daughter, and now he is being told that one of the men responsible could return to society after only a few years. He begs Nick not to accept the deal and insists that both men deserve to be held accountable for what happened inside his home. But Nick has already committed himself. He explains that courts cannot operate according to what prosecutors personally believe happened. Everything depends on what can actually be proved with admissible evidence. In Nick's mind, sending Rupert to death row while guaranteeing a conviction against Darby still counts as a successful outcome. To Clyde, however, calling it a victory feels almost insulting. The case moves into court exactly as Nick planned. Rupert is portrayed as the more responsible of the two defendants, while Darby benefits from his cooperation with the prosecution. Throughout the proceedings, Darby shows little genuine remorse. At one point, he even gives Nick a smug look, almost as if he understands perfectly well that the system has allowed him to escape the punishment he truly deserves. The plea agreement is accepted. Once the hearing ends, Nick steps outside and speaks to reporters about the result. Darby also emerges, and with obvious sarcasm, he thanks Nick for what he has done for him. Clyde watches everything from a distance. Seeing the man involved in his family's murder casually walk away with such a reduced sentence leaves him staring at the justice system in an entirely different way. Later that evening, Nick returns home to his wife, Kelly. He is emotionally drained by the case, though he still tries to convince himself that he made the best decision available. Kelly is pregnant at the time, and Nick speaks affectionately toward their unborn child, using the quiet family moment to push away some of the discomfort surrounding the case. 10 years pass. Nick's life has moved forward, and his daughter is now much older. Professionally, he remains successful and consumed by his work, but that ambition has come at a cost. His job repeatedly takes priority over his family, and he once again misses one of his daughter's school performances. Kelly has grown frustrated with the pattern and makes it clear that Nick is not spending enough time with their child. That same day, Rupert is scheduled to be executed. Instead of attending his daughter's performance, Nick goes to the prison with his colleague Sarah to witness the lethal injection. Rupert is strapped down and prepared for execution. Just before the drugs are administered, he insists once more that he was not the person who murdered Clyde's family. The statement leaves both Nick and Sarah visibly uncomfortable. Then the execution begins. Something goes terribly wrong. The chemicals flowing into Rupert's body do not kill him peacefully. Instead, he begins convulsing violently, screaming as unbearable pain takes over. His body twists against the restraints, while everyone in the viewing area watches in shock. What was supposed to be a controlled execution turns into a horrifying and prolonged death. Afterward, the prison warden insists that nothing like this has happened before. According to him, the procedure should never have caused that level of suffering, and the prison staff cannot explain why Rupert died in such agony. A police officer soon approaches Nick and the others carrying a small bottle connected to the execution. Written on it is a message containing the same chilling idea Darby once said inside Clyde's home years earlier, the suggestion that fate cannot be escaped. Nick immediately recognizes the significance. Attention quickly shifts toward Darby. Police begin tracking his location while Darby, now living freely again, goes about his day unaware of what is closing in around him. While he is distracted, he receives a phone call from someone using a distorted, muffled voice. The caller begins revealing private details about Darby's life, information that no random stranger should know. Darby's confidence disappears. The mysterious caller tells him to look outside. When Darby glances through the window, he sees police vehicles closing in from several directions. Panic takes over. Rather than surrender, he grabs a gun and opens fire toward the approaching officers and their cars. Almost immediately, the strange caller contacts him again. The voice tells Darby that if he wants to avoid being arrested, he needs to throw away his weapon and follow instructions carefully. He is directed toward an abandoned industrial area, where the caller claims an escape route has already been prepared. Desperate and believing this unknown person is helping him, Darby follows the directions. Eventually, he reaches a police vehicle. Inside is an officer who appears to have been incapacitated with a taser and left unconscious. Darby wastes no time. He takes control of the situation, grabs the officer's weapon, and forces the man to drive him away. The two eventually arrive at an isolated location far from immediate police attention. Once there, Darby orders the officer out of the vehicle and forces him down onto his knees. Darby assumes he has successfully escaped the authorities and now has complete control. Then another phone call comes through. The distorted voice speaks again, and Darby suddenly realizes that the person who has been guiding his escape was never trying to rescue him at all. His supposed helper is the very officer standing in front of him. Darby's sense of relief vanishes the moment his supposed rescuer finally reveals who he really is. It is Clyde. Terrified, Darby immediately tries to shoot him, but the weapon has already been modified. Instead of firing normally, the gun delivers a chemical into Darby's body. Within seconds, his muscles stop responding. He remains completely conscious and aware of everything happening around him, yet he can no longer move or defend himself. Clyde transports him to a warehouse he has carefully prepared in advance. Darby wakes fully restrained, strapped down so securely that escape is impossible. Clyde calmly explains what is about to happen. He tells Darby that the pain waiting for him will be unlike anything he has ever experienced, and he has designed the entire process so that Darby stays alive long enough to feel every part of it. Nothing about the setup is impulsive. Every instrument has been arranged beforehand. Every step has been considered. Clyde has spent years thinking about this moment, and now that Darby is helpless in front of him, he intends to stretch out the punishment for as long as he possibly can. Before beginning, Clyde reminds Darby of what happened 10 years earlier. Back then, Clyde had been the one unable to move, forced to watch while his family was destroyed in front of him. Now their positions have been completely reversed. With cold satisfaction, Clyde repeats Darby's own philosophy back to him, reminding him that fate is not something a person can simply escape. Then he activates a camera. Clyde records everything as he begins methodically cutting Darby apart, turning the revenge into something deliberately calculated rather than a sudden act of rage. Meanwhile, Nick and Sarah are still trying to understand what happened during Rupert's execution. The possibility that the lethal injection was deliberately sabotaged becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Sarah considers whether Darby might somehow be responsible, but Nick quickly dismisses the idea. In his opinion, Darby simply does not possess the intelligence, patience, or technical ability required to orchestrate something that sophisticated. Not long afterward, the police make a horrifying discovery. Darby's body has been found, or rather, what remains of it. Investigators discover that he has been divided into roughly 25 separate pieces. The brutality of the killing immediately changes the direction of the investigation, and when the details are reported back to Nick, even he is disturbed by the sheer precision involved. Sarah begins connecting the dots. There is one person who has an obvious reason to hate both Rupert and Darby: Clyde. She starts looking more closely into his recent activities and discovers several unusual financial moves. Clyde has sold off or liquidated much of what he owned and redirected his money into seemingly unrelated properties and locations. One of those purchases happens to be the warehouse where Darby's remains were discovered. That is enough to send the police directly to Clyde's home. Clyde, however, shows almost no sign of panic. As police sirens approach from outside, he calmly begins removing his clothes, almost as though he has been expecting them. By the time officers enter, he is waiting for them without resistance. His strangely cooperative attitude makes the scene even more unsettling. He is taken into custody. As he is led away, Clyde fixes his eyes on Nick with an intense, almost threatening stare. He does not need to say much. The look alone suggests that whatever has already happened may only be the beginning. Police search Clyde's house for evidence. Inside, they discover several books dealing with legal procedures and criminal law, suggesting that Clyde has spent considerable time studying how the justice system works. Investigators also find a torn newspaper clipping featuring a photograph of Nick shaking hands with Darby after the plea agreement years earlier. Clyde is brought to the jail and placed inside an interrogation room, still handcuffed. The problem for Nick and the investigators is simple: suspicion is not evidence. They strongly believe Clyde murdered Darby, but there is nothing yet that directly proves he committed the crime. Their best chance is to make him confess. Elsewhere, something far more disturbing is about to happen inside Nick's own home. Nick's daughter receives a DVD that appears to contain footage from her school recital. Excited, she asks Kelly if she can watch it immediately. Kelly tells her no, explaining that they should save it so the family can watch the performance together when Nick gets home. The girl, however, cannot resist. She quietly puts the disc into the player when her mother is not looking. Almost immediately, she realizes that the video has nothing to do with her recital. Instead, the recording shows Clyde carrying out his horrifying revenge on Darby. Nick's daughter is exposed to the brutal footage before anyone can stop her. Back at the jail, Nick enters the interrogation room to confront Clyde directly. Before the questioning continues, Nick shuts down the live monitoring feed so that the conversation will feel more private. Then he tries a different strategy. Rather than accusing Clyde, Nick acts almost impressed. He pretends to sympathize with what Clyde has done, suggesting that maybe Darby finally received the punishment he deserved. Clyde does not fall for the performance, but he does begin talking. He explains that over the years he repeatedly imagined killing both Darby and Rupert. He thought about different methods, different opportunities, and countless ways revenge could be carried out. Nick immediately treats the statement as a confession. Satisfied that Clyde has finally incriminated himself, he gets up to leave, but Clyde stops him. In a calm voice, he begins describing Nick's everyday routine with disturbing accuracy. He knows where Nick goes when he leaves and how his days are structured. Clyde then politely suggests that Nick sit back down. Nick refuses to be intimidated and insists that the interview is finished. Clyde reminds him that it is not. Nothing Clyde has said actually amounts to a legally valid confession. Thinking about murder is not the same thing as admitting to committing one. He has never directly stated that he killed Darby, and Clyde knows perfectly well that the authorities have no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Even the warehouse proves very little. Clyde owns numerous properties around the country. If necessary, he could simply claim that someone deliberately placed Darby's remains inside one of his buildings in order to frame him. Frustrated, Nick tells Clyde that everyone knows he is responsible. Clyde immediately turns Nick's own philosophy against him, knowing something is meaningless in court unless it can actually be proven. Nick realizes exactly what Clyde is doing. The same logic that once allowed Darby to receive a reduced sentence is now protecting the man seeking revenge against him. Clyde then offers Nick a deal. He says he will provide a complete confession, but only if Nick gives him something in return. His first demand is almost absurdly simple. He wants a proper bed in his cell. Nick interprets the request as another attempt to manipulate him. His pride takes over, and rather than accepting the bargain, he walks out. Jonas, Nick's superior, is furious when he hears what happened. From Jonas's point of view, exchanging a mattress for a confession is an obvious decision. They currently possess almost no solid evidence against Clyde, so refusing such a minor request makes no practical sense. Nick argues that Clyde is playing games with them. Jonas does not care. He repeatedly tells Nick to stop treating the situation like a personal competition and simply make the deal. Eventually, Clyde receives the mattress he requested. The luxury does not go unnoticed by the other prisoners either. One inmate immediately shows interest in Clyde's upgraded sleeping arrangement, giving the impression that special treatment inside the jail may create its own problems. Soon afterward, Clyde appears in court for a bail hearing. The warden is already irritated by Clyde's behavior and makes his displeasure clear. Nick argues strongly that Clyde should remain in custody and asks the judge to deny bail. Clyde, however, speaks for himself. He presents himself as an ordinary citizen who has followed the law throughout his life. He points out that Nick has failed to produce actual evidence connecting him to Darby's murder and argues that the government cannot simply imprison someone indefinitely because prosecutors believe he is guilty. Nick responds by reminding the court that Clyde promised to provide a full confession and has not done so. For a moment, the judge appears persuaded by Clyde's argument. It looks as though she may actually release him. Then Clyde suddenly starts clapping. Everyone in the courtroom turns toward him. Clyde sarcastically congratulates the judge and openly mocks her for being willing to release a suspected murderer simply because he delivered a convincing speech. He attacks the logic of the system and accuses the court of being dangerously naive. The entire room is stunned. Clyde continues pushing. He insults the judge, criticizes her judgment, and refuses to stop even after being warned. Eventually, she has had enough. Furious at his behavior, the judge orders Clyde removed from the courtroom and denies his request for bail. Back in the interrogation room, Clyde speaks with Nick again. He refers to the recording sent to Nick's family as an example of good defeating evil. He finally acknowledges that he is indeed the person seen in the video with Darby. It is the closest thing Nick has received to a direct admission, but Clyde says there is still more. He claims he has another confession to make, although once again, he expects something in exchange. Nick is already tired of the games. Clyde continues anyway. This time, he wants an extravagant prison meal, a 20-ounce steak cooked medium rare. Along with it, he wants an iPod delivered during lunch. Nick can barely believe the demand. He turns to leave, clearly finished with Clyde's theatrics. That is when Clyde gives him a reason to reconsider. He says the next confession can save the life of Bill Reynolds. Bill was Darby's defense attorney during the original case. Nick immediately understands the implication. When he returns to speak with Sarah, she confirms the situation has suddenly become much more serious. Bill Reynolds has already been missing for 3 days. Clyde looks directly into the surveillance camera and gives Nick another set of instructions. If Nick wants Bill Reynolds to remain alive, every demand must be carried out exactly as ordered, and everything has to be completed by 1:00 p.m. the following day. When the deadline arrives, prison staff bring Clyde the meal he requested. The steak is prepared exactly to his specifications, but with only a few minutes remaining before 1:00, the warden decides to inspect everything one final time. That unnecessary delay costs them precious minutes. By the time the food actually reaches Clyde's cell, it is already 8 minutes past the deadline. Clyde remains completely calm. He finally gives Nick the location where Bill is being held, but then adds one crucial detail. The 1:00 deadline was never about when Clyde received his lunch. That deadline belonged to Bill. Nick immediately understands what he means. He races to a waiting helicopter, and the team flies toward the location Clyde has provided, desperately hoping they are not too late. Back inside the prison, Clyde casually sits down to enjoy his steak while listening to music. His cellmate joins him, and from the outside, the two men almost appear friendly. Clyde offers him food, shares the moment, and behaves as though the tension between them has disappeared, but the friendliness is entirely fake. Clyde is interested in only one thing from the meal, the large T-shaped bone inside the steak. He turns the music louder and passes the music controller to his cellmate, encouraging him to focus on it. The distraction works perfectly. Without warning, Clyde uses the sharpened steak bone as a weapon. He attacks the other prisoner repeatedly, stabbing him again and again until the man is dead. Once it is over, Clyde calmly returns to his bed, lies down, and waits as if nothing unusual has happened. When the warden finally looks inside the cell, he is confronted by absolute chaos. Meanwhile, Nick and the search team reach the location Clyde provided. They discover Bill buried underground with an oxygen mask connected to a limited air supply. Unfortunately, Bill is already dead. The timing makes the situation even worse. It took Nick and his team roughly 15 minutes to reach the site from the prison. If Clyde's lunch had arrived exactly when he demanded it, Nick would have received Bill's location soon enough to save him. Those 8 wasted minutes made the difference. Not long afterward, Sarah sends Nick another devastating update. Clyde has murdered his cellmate, and because of the killing, the warden is moving him into solitary confinement. Nick goes to see him there. Standing outside Clyde's new cell, Nick demands an explanation. He wants to know why Clyde keeps escalating the situation and why more people have to die over something that happened a decade earlier. Clyde's answer is simple. He wants people to face consequences for the choices they make. Nick then produces something deeply personal. It is the bracelet Clyde's daughter made for him years ago. Nick holds it out and asks whether Clyde truly believes his wife and daughter would approve of everything he is doing now. The question touches a nerve, but Clyde does not back away from his position. In his mind, what he is doing is not meaningless violence. He sees it as a form of justice, something the legal system failed to provide when his family was murdered. Later, Nick and Jonas meet with a government official who knows far more about Clyde's past than anyone on the prosecution team expected. The man paints a frightening picture. Clyde is not simply an angry engineer or grieving father. He is an extraordinarily capable strategist, someone trained to think several moves ahead and design operations so carefully that he can cause people to die without ever being physically present at the scene. According to the official, Clyde specializes in killing from a distance. That changes everything. Even Clyde's imprisonment may be part of the design. The official believes Clyde allowed himself to be arrested because being inside the prison serves a purpose in whatever larger operation he has constructed. He also warns them not to dismiss the murder of Clyde's cellmate as random violence. That man was likely another piece on the board. Everything Clyde does has a reason. The official tells Nick and Jonas to stop looking at each incident separately and start searching for what Clyde intends to do next. Every victim, every demand, and every seemingly unnecessary action could be preparing the ground for another move. His assessment becomes even more disturbing when he explains just how dangerous Clyde truly is. If Clyde has decided someone should die, then simply locking him in a cell will not necessarily protect that person. As far as the official is concerned, the only guaranteed way to stop Clyde is to enter his cell and kill him before he can execute the rest of his plan. He also confirms what Nick already suspects. Clyde is targeting people connected in some way to the case involving his wife and daughter. Armed with this information, Nick and Jonas hurry to Judge Laura. They ask her for extraordinary restrictions against Clyde. In practical terms, they want her to authorize measures that push dangerously close to violating his basic rights. They want his communication with the outside world cut off completely. No visitors, no phone calls, and no unnecessary contact with anyone who might be assisting him. Their argument is that normal procedure is no longer enough. Too many people are already dead. Judge Laura reluctantly agrees and signs the necessary order. Almost immediately afterward, her cell phone rings. She answers it. The device explodes in her hand. Nick and Jonas are left frozen in shock as the judge collapses to the floor, killed instantly by the blast. The message could not be clearer. Clyde is still controlling events from inside prison. Nick confronts him again in the interrogation room. This time, he demands to know who is helping him. There has to be someone operating outside the prison, someone placing explosives, delivering devices, and carrying out Clyde's instructions. Nick also presses him about his obsession with revenge. Clyde finally loses his composure. He is furious because, even after everything that has happened, Nick still does not understand the point. Clyde insists this was never simply about revenge. If all he wanted was to hurt Nick personally, he could have murdered Nick's wife and daughter 10 years ago. He had the opportunity, the ability, and plenty of time, but he did not. His goal is bigger than that. Clyde wants Nick and the entire system to understand the consequences of putting convenience, conviction rates, and negotiated deals ahead of genuine justice. Then Clyde gives Nick an ultimatum. He wants to be released before 6 o'clock the next morning, completely free and without charges. If that does not happen, Clyde warns that everyone involved will pay for the decision. Authorities immediately tighten security. Clyde is moved into an even more secure section of the prison under the supervision of multiple armed guards. Later that night, Nick and Sarah remain at the facility going through boxes of records, financial documents, case files, and everything else they have collected on Clyde. They desperately search for the identity of whoever might be assisting him from outside. Nothing gives them the answer. The deeper they investigate, the more impossible the situation seems. During the long night, Sarah begins questioning something they have avoided talking about for years. She wonders whether they made the wrong decision when they gave Darby the plea bargain. Maybe Clyde was right about that part. Maybe the deal that saved their case also created everything happening now. Nick refuses to accept that conclusion. He tells Sarah they made the best decision available to them at the time. Without the deal, there was a real possibility that both suspects could have walked free. Nick still believes securing convictions was better than gambling and losing the entire case. The district attorney's team remains at the prison until the 6 o'clock deadline passes. Clyde is not released. For a few moments, nothing happens. Believing the immediate danger may have passed, Nick tells everyone to go home and get some rest. The staff begin heading toward the parking area. Sarah gets into her car. Then explosives hidden around the vehicles begin detonating. One blast triggers another. The parking area erupts into fire and destruction as several vehicles explode almost simultaneously. Sarah looks toward Nick through the confusion. Before either of them can react, her own car explodes. She is killed instantly. Nick is devastated. The attack confirms in his mind that Clyde cannot possibly be acting entirely alone. Clyde was locked inside a maximum security prison when the explosives were triggered, yet the operation unfolded exactly as planned. The bombing leaves 6 officers dead. Nick and Jonas are soon summoned to meet with the mayor. She is stunned by the scale of the destruction and cannot understand how one imprisoned man has managed to terrorize the city while sitting inside a cell. With the threat now clearly extending beyond the original case, the mayor assigns personal security details to both Nick and Jonas. Nick immediately turns his attention to protecting his family. He sends Kelly and their daughter away to a secret location, presenting the trip almost like an unexpected vacation, so his daughter will not fully understand what is happening. The precautions are extreme. They are told not to use credit cards. They cannot make ordinary mobile phone calls. Anything that could create a digital trail or reveal where they are staying must be avoided. Nick wants them completely invisible until Clyde is stopped. After seeing his family off, Nick returns inside his house. That is when he notices something that makes his blood run cold. A framed newspaper article has been deliberately left where he will see it. Nick immediately realizes what it means. Someone has already been inside his home. Clyde's reach is even closer than he feared. Later, back at the prison, Clyde is permitted to leave his cell for a supervised walk. As guards escort him through the secure area, he unexpectedly comes face-to-face with Nick and the detective. Nick finally loses control. Overcome with anger, he attacks Clyde and beats him while the guards struggle to contain the situation. Even after taking the blows, Clyde remains eerily composed. He looks at Nick and warns him that everything they have witnessed so far is only the beginning. The detective, equally furious, pulls out his weapon and appears ready to shoot Clyde on the spot. Nick stops him. As Clyde is taken away, he leaves them with another chilling promise. What is coming next, he says, will be remembered on a historic scale. Not long afterward, Sarah's funeral is held. The atmosphere is heavy, and everyone involved is still trying to process how many lives have already been lost. During the funeral, Jonas admits something Nick has refused to say aloud. In his view, their own choices helped create the disaster unfolding around them. The plea bargain, the compromises, the belief that securing a conviction mattered more than delivering the punishment Clyde expected. Jonas believes they are now living with the consequences. Nick still insists that they made the correct legal decision 10 years ago, but this time, his certainty is weaker. For the first time, he seems to be seriously questioning whether Clyde's entire campaign has exposed something Nick never wanted to admit. When the funeral ends, Nick and Jonas leave in heavily secured vehicles surrounded by protection. Unknown to them, another attack is already being prepared. Some distance away, a mysterious figure dressed completely in black takes control of a military-style unmanned drone. This is no ordinary surveillance device. The drone is equipped with multiple weapons, including a mounted machine gun, an electromagnetic pulse system, and a rocket launcher. The operator directs it toward the convoy. Moments later, the drone deploys its electronic weapon. The secured vehicles suddenly lose power and roll to a stop. Before anyone can understand what has happened, the attack begins. The drone opens fire on Jonas's vehicle, sending round after round into the armored transport. The barrage tears through the convoy and leaves the occupants trapped inside. but the attacker is not satisfied. Determined to make absolutely certain Jonas does not survive, the drone locks onto the vehicle one final time. A rocket is launched. It strikes the transport directly. The explosion completely destroys the vehicle, killing Jonas and everyone inside. Once again, Clyde appears to have eliminated another person connected to the original case without ever being physically present. The mayor is furious. The number of deaths is rising, public fear is spreading, and the city government now appears powerless against a man who is supposedly locked behind prison walls. She confronts Nick over how far the situation has escalated under his watch. For a moment, it appears she may remove him from his position entirely. Instead, political pressure changes the decision. With the media demanding answers and leadership, the mayor needs someone publicly responsible for handling the crisis. Rather than firing Nick, she promotes him. Nick is appointed district attorney. At the same time, the mayor declares emergency restrictions across the city, limiting movement, as authorities attempt to prevent another attack. Nick now has more authority than before, but the promotion brings little satisfaction. Sarah is dead, Jonas is dead, and Clyde is still somehow controlling events. Then a new lead arrives. Nick receives an email connected to research Sarah had been conducting before her death. The information involves real estate transactions linked to Clyde. Nick begins examining properties sold throughout Philadelphia during the previous 10 years. Instead of focusing only on obvious buildings connected to Clyde, he compares purchase prices, property values, locations, and ownership histories. Eventually, one property stands out. It is a small garage located surprisingly close to the prison. Clyde owns it. Nick immediately contacts the detective, and the two head there to investigate. At first, the garage looks ordinary. Then they discover something hidden beneath the floor. A concealed opening leads underground. Nick and the detective climb down and find themselves inside an elaborate tunnel system. The discovery changes their understanding of everything. Clyde has secretly dug a passage directly beneath the prison. Even more astonishing, the tunnel has access points leading into individual cells. Clyde was never completely trapped inside prison. He could enter and leave his cell without anyone knowing. The supposed impossibility of the murders suddenly makes sense. There was no outside accomplice controlling the operation. Clyde had been doing much of it himself. The tunnel also reveals another disturbing truth. His cellmate's murder was never an impulsive act. Clyde had specifically positioned himself to reach that cell and had planned the killing long before it happened. Every detail had been arranged. The detective immediately checks Clyde's cell. It is empty. While Nick and the detective uncover the underground network, Clyde is already moving toward the next stage of his plan. Disguised as a maintenance worker or janitor, he approaches City Hall. His appearance is ordinary enough to avoid suspicion. He passes through a relatively light security inspection and enters the building without anyone realizing who he really is. Back inside the tunnel, Nick and the detective continue searching through Clyde's equipment. They discover surveillance feeds. Clyde has installed hidden cameras in multiple locations. One of them is inside Nick's home. That explains how he always seemed to know so much about Nick's family and movements. Clyde has been watching him. Among the equipment, Nick notices a quotation associated with military strategist Karl von Clausewitz. The message refers to identifying an opponent's center of gravity, the key point where power is concentrated. Nick immediately understands the implication. For Clyde, the city's center of gravity is City Hall, and the mayor is about to hold an important security meeting there. Nick realizes that Clyde's next target is not a single prosecutor, judge, or official. He intends to wipe out the city's leadership in one strike. Authorities rush toward City Hall, but Nick and the detective know they cannot simply charge inside and create panic. If Clyde is monitoring the building, any obvious evacuation or security response could alert him that his plan has been discovered. They have to proceed quietly. The search leads them to the 5th floor, directly beneath the room where the mayor and senior officials are preparing to meet. There, Nick and the detective locate a suspicious suitcase. They immediately suspect that it contains Clyde's bomb. A bomb technician carefully examines it. When the case is opened, their fears are confirmed. The device is powerful enough to destroy the conference room above. Worse, the expert determines that the bomb is connected to a remote trigger. A simple mobile phone call could activate it. It could explode at any moment. Meanwhile, officers assigned to keep watch near Clyde's property notice movement. Clyde has returned. They alert Nick. Clyde enters the underground facility and moves toward the equipment he has prepared. Through his surveillance setup, he watches as the security meeting begins at City Hall. The mayor and other officials are now gathered in the exact location he intended. Everything is ready. Clyde takes out his phone. Then he begins climbing through the tunnel toward his prison cell. When he emerges inside, someone is already waiting. Nick. Clyde is genuinely caught off guard. Nick points a gun at him and tells him to stop. He urges Clyde to finally make the right decision and surrender before anyone else dies. Clyde looks at him almost amusingly. After everything that has happened, he asks whether Nick has come to negotiate one more deal. That question makes Nick understand the lesson Clyde has been forcing on him from the beginning. For years, Nick solved difficult situations by bargaining. He negotiated with Darby because it was safer than risking a trial. He traded favors with Clyde in exchange for information. Again and again, he chose deals because they produced results. Now Nick refuses. He tells Clyde there will be no negotiation. He will not make deals with murderers anymore. Nick then gives Clyde one final opportunity to stop the attack himself. He tells him to put the phone down and think carefully about what he is about to do. If Clyde activates that bomb, there will be no way to take the decision back. He will have to live with it for whatever remains of his life. For a moment, Clyde seems to consider the warning. Then he quietly apologizes. He presses the button and makes the call. The bomb is activated. Nick turns toward the exit. Before leaving, he tells Clyde there is one problem with his statement. Clyde will not have much of a life left to regret anything. He has approximately 25 seconds. Clyde's expression changes. At the same moment, the detective seals the tunnel from the other side, preventing Clyde from escaping through his hidden route. Only then does Clyde realize what Nick has done. The bomb is no longer inside City Hall. While Clyde was returning to his cell, Nick and the detective moved the suitcase. Nick placed it beneath Clyde's own bed. Now Clyde is trapped inside the very prison cell he once used as the center of his operation. With only seconds remaining, he stops trying to escape. He reaches for the bracelet his daughter made for him all those years ago. The small object brings him back to the life he had before everything changed, to his wife, his daughter, and the family that was taken from him. Clyde looks at the bracelet one final time. Then the bomb detonates. The explosion consumes the cell in flames, bringing Clyde's carefully constructed campaign to an end. And with that, the story comes full circle. Clyde began as a grieving husband and father who believed the justice system had failed his family. Over the next decade, that grief transformed into a calculated mission to punish everyone he believed had contributed to that failure. But by the end, the same question remains hanging over everything he did. Was Clyde exposing a deeply flawed system and delivering the justice he had been denied, or did his pursuit of accountability eventually turn him into something just as dangerous as the people he wanted punished? That is the end of the story. Thanks for watching, and I would really like to hear your opinion. After everything that happened, do you think Clyde deserves any sympathy for what he did, or was the justice provided by the courts ultimately the only kind of justice he had the right to seek? Law-abiding citizen doesn't waste much time before putting Clyde Shelton through the kind of nightmare that basically defines everything he becomes afterward. He's at home with his wife and daughter, living what looks like a completely normal life, and then two men break in. The attack is ugly, sudden, and intentionally hard to watch. Clyde survives, but his family doesn't, and that's really the emotional engine of the entire movie. The thing is, the film moves through this setup so quickly that we barely get to know Clyde's wife or daughter before they're gone. That's probably one of the weaknesses of the opening. You understand his pain because the situation itself is horrific, but you don't necessarily feel like you knew these people. A little more time with the family might have made Clyde's grief hit even harder. Still, the scene does what it needs to do. It gives him a reason to believe that the justice system is going to be the one thing left that can make any of this mean something. Then Nick Rice enters the picture. Nick is a successful prosecutor, and he clearly takes pride in his record. The problem is that maintaining a strong conviction rate sometimes means making deals. From his perspective, getting some kind of conviction is safer than going to trial, losing everything, and watching a guilty man walk away completely. That might make sense on paper. Try explaining it to Clyde. One of the men responsible for destroying his family gets a deal in exchange for helping convict the other. Legally, Nick can justify it. Professionally, he can probably justify it even more easily. But Clyde isn't looking at statistics. He watched his wife and child die. So when he's basically told that justice has to be negotiated because that's how the system works, something breaks. And this is where the movie becomes much more interesting than a basic revenge thriller, at least for a while. Because Clyde isn't just angry at the killers anymore. He's angry at the process. He's angry that something so horrible can be reduced to evidence, conviction percentages, plea bargains, and whatever outcome the prosecution thinks it can safely secure. You can disagree with what he eventually does, and obviously, the movie pushes him way beyond any reasonable line, but it's difficult not to understand why he feels betrayed here. That's important. The system doesn't fail him because nobody is arrested. The killers are caught. It fails him because the result doesn't feel anything like justice from his point of view, and there's a real difference between those two things. Nick sees compromise as part of making the law function. Clyde sees compromise with a murderer. That's basically the crack everything else grows out of. Then the film jumps forward 10 years. Clyde has had a decade to sit with all of this. Not move on, not forgive anybody. Plan. And when he comes back into the story, he's not the helpless guy from the opening anymore. The first stages of his revenge are where the movie is at its strongest because Clyde still feels like a person rather than some kind of unstoppable movie mastermind. He's calculated, absolutely. Cold too. But there is still a clear emotional line connecting what he's doing now to what happened to him before. That's why the audience can find themselves in a really uncomfortable position. You're watching a man commit horrible acts, but at first there's still this tiny voice going, I get why he's doing it. Not approving it, just understanding it. And that distinction is what gives the film some real weight. Clyde doesn't immediately declare war on the entire world either. His revenge starts with the people directly connected to his family's murder. That's a much simpler motivation. They hurt his family. The system didn't punish them the way he believed it should, so now he's going to do it himself. It's ugly, but emotionally you can follow it. Then the mission starts expanding. That's where Clyde's transformation becomes more complicated. At first, the killers are responsible. Then Nick is responsible because he made the deal. Then people around the prosecution become responsible because they're part of the same system. Before long, Clyde isn't really avenging his family anymore. He's trying to prove something. He's trying to teach the justice system a lesson. And once that happens, revenge becomes ideology. That's a big shift. He's not just saying, you failed me. He's saying, the entire structure is broken, and I'm going to expose it. The problem is that the movie also starts changing Clyde in a way that makes him less believable. The opening works because he feels like an ordinary man who suffered something extraordinary. Later, we learn more about what he's capable of, and suddenly, this supposedly ordinary family man has the kind of planning skills, technical knowledge, resources, and operational ability that make everyone else in the movie look completely helpless. He goes from being prepared to being almost impossible to surprise. That's where I think the character loses something. Clyde is scarier when he feels human, a grieving father who spent 10 years planning revenge. That's disturbing because you can imagine the obsession. A man who can seemingly predict every reaction, manipulate events from almost anywhere, and build an answer for every possible problem. Now we're in a different kind of movie. And the more powerful he becomes, the less important the original tragedy starts to feel. That's the strange thing about Clyde Shelton's arc. The movie begins by making him painfully relatable. Then it slowly turns him into someone almost mythic. You understand the father, you understand the victim, you even understand the rage. But once Clyde becomes a criminal mastermind who appears capable of controlling nearly everything around him, the emotional connection gets weaker. He's no longer just a man broken by the justice system. He's becoming the movie's supervillain, and I don't think that transformation is completely smooth. There are moments where the film still wants us to remember the guy from the opening, the husband, the father, the person who trusted the system and got crushed by it. Then 5 minutes later, he's pulling off something so elaborate that you start thinking less about his grief and more about how any human being could possibly have arranged all this. That hurts the premise. Because the really unsettling version of law-abiding citizen isn't about some unstoppable genius attacking the system. It's about what happens when a normal person loses faith in that system completely. That's much darker. Clyde's journey works best when it feels like a tragedy. He starts as the victim, then he becomes a vigilante. Then the vigilante starts believing his pain gives him the right to decide who deserves punishment. And somewhere along the way, he's no longer fighting injustice. He's creating more of it. That's the point where the movie should probably make us turn against him completely. But because his original grievance is so understandable, it never becomes quite that simple. And that's what keeps the setup interesting. The law failed Clyde. That doesn't justify everything Clyde does afterward. But the fact that both of those things can be true at the same time is exactly why the first part of Law-Abiding Citizen works as well as it does. What makes Law-Abiding Citizen more interesting than a standard revenge movie is that it keeps messing with your sense of who you're supposed to support. Normally, this kind of story is simple. One guy is wronged, he goes after the people responsible, and the movie basically tells you when to cheer. Here, it's not that clean. Clyde Shelton is obviously doing terrible things. There really isn't a way around that. He crosses lines early and then keeps crossing them until revenge turns into something much bigger and uglier. But the movie has already done something dangerous by that point. It made you understand him first. You've seen what happened to his family. You've watched the legal system make a deal that feels completely unacceptable from his point of view. So even when Clyde starts doing things you can't defend, there's still a part of the audience that remembers why he became this person. And that complicates everything. Nick Rice is supposed to be the other side of the argument. He's not some cartoonishly corrupt prosecutor. That's important. He's ambitious, absolutely, and he's comfortable making compromises if they help secure convictions, but he sees those choices as part of how the system works. That's the whole divide between these two men. Nick believes justice has to operate within rules. Clyde believes rules mean nothing if they protect the wrong people. Neither position is completely ridiculous when the movie first puts them against each other. And that's where the film is at its best, because Clyde isn't only trying to hurt Nick, he's trying to prove Nick wrong. That's a much better conflict than just one guy chasing another. Whenever these two are sitting across from each other, in court, in prison, during negotiations, the movie gets sharper. The action almost becomes secondary because the real fight is happening in the conversation. Clyde keeps forcing Nick to confront the choices he made. Why did you make that deal? Why was your conviction record more important than doing what was right? Why should people trust a system that can look at something obviously horrible and still reduce it to negotiation? Nick's answer, even when he doesn't say it directly, is basically that the alternative is chaos. The law can't work according to individual emotion. You can't just decide someone deserves punishment and then carry it out yourself. And he's right about that, but Clyde's response is equally uncomfortable. What happens when the people following the rules are still producing an unjust result? That's the question the movie keeps poking at. Not very subtly sometimes, but it's there. And I think that's also why so many viewers end up rooting for Clyde longer than the movie probably expects them to. He's committing murder. He's terrorizing people. Eventually, he's targeting individuals who weren't directly responsible for what happened to his family. At some point, logically, sympathy should be gone, except it isn't always. Because Nick and the system never completely erase Clyde's original argument. The plea deal still happened. The compromise still happened. Nobody can suddenly make that feel morally satisfying just because Clyde later becomes monstrous. So the film gets trapped in this weird place where the villain is clearly doing worse things than the people he's attacking, but he can still sound more convincing than they do. That's actually pretty fascinating. There are moments where Clyde feels less like someone trying to escape justice and more like someone running a demonstration. Look at the courtroom scene. He understands exactly how the rules work. He uses the legal system's own logic to argue his way toward freedom, and when it works, instead of celebrating, he basically turns around and exposes how absurd that decision is. That's Clyde in one scene. He doesn't just want to break the system. He wants the system to embarrass itself, and Nick is the person he has chosen to teach. Their relationship almost becomes a twisted teacher and student dynamic. Clyde is basically saying, "You made the wrong choice 10 years ago, and I'm going to force you to understand why." Nick, meanwhile, gradually realizes this isn't just a murder investigation anymore. It's personal. Every move Clyde makes is designed to challenge his beliefs, his career, his confidence, and eventually his sense of safety. That's where the psychological chess match side of the film really works. Clyde plans, Nick reacts. Nick thinks he's figured something out. Clyde reveals that he's already anticipated it. Sometimes it becomes ridiculous, sure, but before the movie pushes it too far, there is a real thrill in watching Nick realize how badly he's underestimated the person sitting in front of him. What also makes the conflict work is that both men are flawed in ways the film doesn't always fully resolve. Nick isn't evil, he's just too comfortable with compromise. Clyde isn't simply evil either, at least not at first. He's someone who becomes convinced that his suffering gives him moral authority. That's dangerous, because once Clyde decides he alone knows what justice should look like, there is no limit anymore. First it's the killers, then it's Nick. Then it's everyone who participated in the case. Then it's the institution. And once you're blaming an entire system, almost anybody can become a target. That's where vigilante justice stops feeling like justice at all. But the movie also understands why that fantasy appeals to people. Most of us, if something horrible happened, would still rely on the legal system. That's reality. But cinema gives you this strange space where you can imagine doing the opposite. No appeals, no negotiations, no technicalities, just direct consequences. There's a cathartic side to that, even if it's morally ugly, and law-abiding citizen knows exactly how to exploit it. You're not supposed to literally endorse what Clyde does, but the movie knows there is a difference between approving of revenge and emotionally understanding the desire for it. That's why some of the deaths almost play like guilty wish fulfillment. The authorities who looked arrogant suddenly look helpless. The people who trusted procedure suddenly have no control. The system that told Clyde to accept compromise is now dealing with someone who refuses to compromise at all. There's something darkly satisfying about that setup, until the cost becomes too high, and that is where the movie should have expanded the conversation beyond Clyde and Nick. If a man started doing what Clyde does, the public reaction would be huge. People would be arguing about him everywhere. Some would call him a terrorist. Some would call him a vigilante. Some would absolutely condemn him. Others would probably say, I don't support what he's doing, but I understand why he's angry. That public debate could have made the movie much richer. Instead, we're mostly told that people are panicking. We don't really see the argument happening outside the government and legal system. That's a missed opportunity, because Clyde isn't attacking some random institution. He's attacking something every citizen has to trust, at least to some degree. So imagine if the movie had shown ordinary people losing faith, or defending the system, or arguing over whether Clyde exposed something real. That would have taken the story beyond a personal revenge battle and made it a much bigger moral conflict. Instead, almost everyone outside Clyde and Nick becomes part of the machinery, a target, an investigator, an official, someone waiting for the next move. And that's a shame because the movie has exactly the kind of premise that should divide people. Even inside the audience, it already does. One viewer looks at Clyde and sees a psychopath. Another sees a broken man who went too far. Someone else sees Nick as the responsible adult trying to restore order. Another person sees him as the reason Clyde exists in the first place. There's no comfortable position, and I think that's why the Clyde-Nick relationship stays interesting even when the plot starts getting silly. They aren't really fighting over who wins. They're fighting over whose definition of justice survives. Nick believes a flawed system is still better than one person deciding everything. Clyde believes a system that knowingly compromises justice has forfeited its moral authority. Take either belief too far, and you get something ugly. A system obsessed with procedure can become cold and indifferent. A man obsessed with personal justice becomes a tyrant. That's the gray area law-abiding citizen keeps circling. And strangely, the movie never fully solves it. Maybe that's partly a weakness. But it's also the reason the film sticks with people. Because even after Clyde becomes impossible to defend, the question that created him is still sitting there. What do you do when the law gives you an answer, but it doesn't feel anything like justice? If there's one thing law-abiding citizen really understands, it's that this movie lives or dies on Clyde Shelton. And Gerard Butler knows it. This is the kind of role that could have gone completely off the rails. Clyde has to be grieving, terrifying, intelligent, unpredictable, wounded, and somehow still believable enough that you understand why people are drawn to him. Butler gets a lot of that right. What works best is the calmness. He doesn't spend the whole movie shouting or trying to look dangerous. A lot of the menace comes from how relaxed he seems. He can be sitting in a prison cell, barely moving, and still feel like the most powerful person in the room. That's much more effective than just playing Clyde as an angry revenge machine. There's always this feeling that he knows something everyone else doesn't, and usually he does. That confidence makes him incredibly watchable. You're waiting for the next line, the next move, the next reveal. Even when the plot starts getting ridiculous, Butler keeps Clyde interesting because there's personality behind the planning. He also sells the emotional side better than I expected. The movie doesn't spend a huge amount of time developing Clyde before the tragedy, but Butler still gives you enough grief and bitterness that the later transformation doesn't feel completely disconnected. You can see that this guy has spent years living inside the same moment. That matters. Now, not everyone is going to love the performance. I can understand the criticism that Butler pushes Clyde a little too far into theatrical mastermind territory. There are scenes where the character becomes less like a damaged father and more like someone doing a very controlled supervillain routine. The voice, the confidence, the little smiles, the way he seems completely unfazed by everything around him. It can feel slightly overplayed depending on how seriously you take the movie. And once the screenplay starts giving Clyde almost impossible abilities, that performance style becomes even more noticeable. But even then, I'd still say Butler is the reason the character holds together as long as he does. He has presence that's hard to fake. Jamie Foxx has a much tougher job as Nick Rice, not because Foxx is incapable, but because the screenplay gives Clyde nearly all the fun material. Clyde gets the speeches. Clyde gets the mystery. Clyde gets the threats. Clyde gets the shocking reveals. Nick gets to walk into rooms and discover what Clyde has already done. That imbalance affects how the performances feel. Foxx plays Nick as confident, professional, ambitious, sometimes arrogant. That fits the character. but early on, Nick isn't especially likable. He's proud of his record, he believes in the way he does his job, and he doesn't seem particularly interested in how Clyde experiences the plea deal emotionally. That can make him feel colder than the movie probably intends, which is strange, because Nick is technically the character operating on the lawful side of the story. You would think he'd be easier to support. He isn't, at least not initially. Foxx also plays him fairly straight, which becomes a problem when he's standing opposite Butler, who gets to be unpredictable in almost every scene. There are moments where Nick feels less like Clyde's equal and more like the guy reacting to Clyde's performance. That said, I do think Foxx gets better once the movie turns into a full cat-and-mouse game. The more personal the conflict becomes, the more interesting Nick gets. He starts losing that polished prosecutor confidence. Suddenly, this isn't about conviction rates or courtroom strategy anymore. People around him are dying. His own choices are being thrown back in his face. His family becomes vulnerable. And you can see the character slowly realizing that this case is exposing things about him that he probably never wanted to examine. Those later scenes between Foxx and Butler are much stronger. There's more tension, more frustration, more desperation, and the relationship starts to feel like two men actually trying to break each other psychologically. That's where Foxx works best in the film. The problem is that Nick's character development can be messy. He'll make a decision that seems emotionally logical, then the plot pushes him in another direction very quickly. The whole issue of his career ambition is a good example. Nick is supposed to be learning something from Clyde. He's supposed to confront the consequences of treating justice like a numbers game, but the film never completely convinces you that he has changed as deeply as the story seems to want. Sometimes his choices feel motivated by character. Sometimes they feel motivated by the screenplay needing him in a particular place. And that weakens Foxx too, because an actor can only do so much when the character's internal logic keeps shifting. There's also a missed opportunity with Nick's family. Once Clyde's campaign threatens them, that should add a whole new emotional dimension. Now Nick understands what it feels like to have the system, or in this case one man, put the people he loves in danger. That should hit hard, but the movie hasn't really spent enough time with Nick's family for those scenes to land as strongly as they could. We understand that he's afraid, we understand the stakes, but emotionally, it's a little thin. And that's interesting because the film has almost the same problem with Clyde's family. Both men are defined partly by what happens to the people they love, but those family relationships are mostly there to motivate the men rather than exist as fully developed relationships of their own. The supporting cast is solid though. Comini brings exactly the kind of grounded, tired, experienced energy the movie needs. He feels like someone who has spent years dealing with ugly cases and doesn't have much patience for nonsense. That helps because as Clyde's plans become more elaborate, you need at least a few characters who still feel like they belong in a real crime thriller. Bruce McGill has that same dependable quality. He doesn't have to do anything flashy. He just feels credible whenever he's on screen, and in a movie that becomes less credible as it goes along, that actually matters. Viola Davis has a relatively small role, and reactions to her seem pretty divided. Personally, I think the important thing is that she brings authority. The second she enters a scene, you believe this is someone who expects people to listen. There's intensity there. Whether every speech works is another question, but she does add weight to the government side of the story. Leslie Bibb has less to work with. Her character is part of Nick's professional world, but like a lot of the supporting players, she never really gets to develop into a separate perspective on what Clyde is doing. And that's probably the bigger issue with the entire supporting cast. It isn't necessarily that the actors are weak, most of them aren't. It's that the movie doesn't really use them. Almost everybody becomes part of Clyde and Nick's chessboard. One person is there to investigate something. Another person delivers information. Someone becomes a target. Someone gives Nick an order. Someone reacts to Clyde's latest move, and then we move on. Very few of these characters get to have their own opinion about the larger issue. That feels like a missed opportunity, because imagine if the people around Nick actually disagreed with him. Imagine if one prosecutor thought Clyde had a point, or a detective hated what Clyde was doing, but also admitted the original deal was wrong, or somebody inside the government believed the system needed defending at any cost. That would have made the supporting cast part of the moral debate. Instead, most of them function as pieces in the thriller. Useful pieces, sometimes very well-acted pieces, but still pieces. And that puts even more pressure on Butler and Foxx. Thankfully, Butler carries a lot of that weight. Foxx has his moments too, especially once the conflict becomes personal, but there's no question about who owns the movie. Whenever Clyde is on screen, the energy changes. You may hate what he's doing. You may stop believing how he's doing it, but you're still watching him. And in a film built around a character who is supposed to control everyone around him, Gerard Butler pretty much does the same thing to the audience. One thing law-abiding citizen gets right more often than not is momentum. Even when the story starts asking you to accept some pretty wild logic, F. Gary Gray keeps the movie moving with enough confidence that, for a while, you kind of just go with it. And that matters here, because this is a film that could have collapsed under the weight of its own setup. You have courtroom drama, prison manipulation, revenge killings, investigations, moral debates, elaborate traps, explosions. There's a lot going on. Gray's approach is basically to keep the pressure on. The movie rarely feels relaxed. Even some of the quieter scenes have this uneasy energy underneath them, like Clyde is still controlling the room even when he's nowhere near it. That's probably one of the better things about the direction. There's always this sense that something is about to happen. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the movie just lets that tension hang there for a while. And when the action finally arrives, it tends to hit hard. The altered lethal injection sequence is probably one of the clearest examples. It's not just violent for the sake of being violent. The way the scene is built is what makes it disturbing. You know an execution is about to happen. Everything is controlled, procedural, almost clinical. Then Clyde's plan starts revealing itself. Suddenly something that should be completely regulated becomes horrifyingly unpredictable. That contrast works. The film does this several times. It takes places and systems that are supposed to feel controlled, courtrooms, prisons, official buildings, legal procedures, and lets Clyde turn them into spaces where nobody really knows what's coming next. That's where the thriller side of the movie is strongest. You're not just waiting to see who gets attacked. You're waiting to understand how Clyde managed to set it up. And for a good stretch, that mystery is genuinely fun. There are a handful of scenes where the movie basically dares you to figure out what he's doing before everyone else does. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And even when the logic gets shaky afterward, the immediate impact of the scene can still work. That's an important distinction with this movie. A lot of individual moments are more effective than the story connecting them. You can watch a revenge sequence and think, okay, that was really well staged. Then 10 minutes later you start thinking about how Clyde possibly arranged it, and the whole thing starts falling apart in your head. But in the moment, it lands. That's Gray's strength here. He knows how to sell the immediate threat. The prison scenes are another good example. Clyde is technically contained. He's locked up. He should have no control. But the movie keeps finding ways to make the prison feel like an extension of his plan rather than the end of it. That reversal is really entertaining. There's something inherently satisfying about watching the authorities believe they've finally neutralized him, only to realize that being in prison might not be the disadvantage they thought it was. Again, ridiculous after a point. But entertaining. The courtroom material is handled well too, mostly because Gray knows when not to overcomplicate things. Gerard Butler can just sit there and talk. The scene doesn't need a chase or some giant reveal every 30 seconds. Clyde's confidence is enough, and that balance is probably what the movie does best in its first half. It knows when to give you a disturbing piece of violence and when to slow things down for a confrontation between Clyde and Nick. The problem is that as the movie goes on, it starts trusting the big moments more than the smaller ones. You can almost feel it deciding that every new sequence has to top the last one, more elaborate, more shocking, more dangerous, more impossible, and eventually the suspense starts changing. Early on, you're thinking, what is Clyde going to do? Later, you're thinking, okay, what completely insane thing has he somehow already planned this time? That's still entertaining, but it's a different kind of entertainment. The film starts as something tense and nasty. It gradually turns into this high-concept game where Clyde seems capable of making almost anything happen, and F. Gary Gray still directs it with a straight face. That's where the tonal problem starts showing. If the movie had leaned into the absurdity a little more, maybe some of those later moments would feel easier to accept, but Gray keeps everything serious. No wink. No real acknowledgement that Clyde has basically become a comic book criminal mastermind. So when something completely unbelievable happens, the film still presents it like we're watching a grounded crime thriller. Sometimes that works because the confidence carries you through. Sometimes it really doesn't. Visually, though, the movie fits its subject pretty well. There's a muted, cold quality to a lot of it. The world doesn't feel colorful or comfortable. Even when the movie is in clean institutional spaces, there's often something slightly lifeless about the image. That suits Clyde's state of mind. This isn't a revenge movie that feels triumphant. It feels bitter, claustrophobic at times. And the sharp contrast in some scenes helps keep that sense of danger alive. There's also that execution sequence intercut with the child's cello performance. It's a strange choice, maybe even a little too obvious. But visually and rhythmically, it sticks with you. You've got this controlled musical performance happening alongside something going horribly wrong, and the contrast creates this weird tension. Does it completely fit the tone? I'm not sure. But it's memorable, and honestly, Law-Abiding Citizen has quite a few moments like that. You might question the taste or the logic, but you remember the scene. The score helps with that too. It does a lot of work in the quieter sections. There are scenes where not much is physically happening, but the music keeps a kind of pressure underneath the conversation. So even when Clyde and Nick are just talking, it still feels like the scene could break open at any second. That's useful because the best parts of the movie aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes it's Clyde sitting completely calm while everyone around him looks nervous. Sometimes it's Nick realizing another part of the plan has already happened. Sometimes it's just the silence before something bad arrives. The score understands that. Then there's the violence. And yeah, this movie is mean. The opening already makes that very clear. The home invasion is brutal, ugly, and not designed to be comfortable. Later, the revenge becomes even more calculated. The killings aren't just quick action movie deaths. Clyde wants people to suffer. He wants them to understand why they're being punished. That gives the violence a nasty edge. And because the movie wants us to remain emotionally connected to Clyde for at least part of the story, that creates a pretty uncomfortable reaction. There are moments where you understand the anger behind what he's doing while still looking at the actual punishment and thinking, no, this has gone way too far. That tension is effective, at least initially. The problem comes when every new act of revenge has to become more outrageous. Eventually, shock starts replacing meaning. The first few attacks matter because they're connected directly to Clyde's grievance. Later, you start getting the sense that the film is thinking more about how to surprise the audience than what the violence is actually saying about the character. That's where some of the brutality becomes less disturbing and more mechanical. You stop processing it emotionally, you just wait for the next setup. Still, as an action thriller, there's a lot here that works. The movie has enough surprises, enough reversals, enough "how did he do that?" moments to keep you involved. And honestly, that's probably why it has such a strong following despite all the criticism. It's easy to pick apart afterward, very easy. But while you're watching it, there are stretches where the thing just moves. You're curious, you're tense. You want to know what Clyde has planned. You want to see how Nick reacts. You want to know whether the authorities are finally going to get ahead of him. And the movie keeps feeding that curiosity. That's real entertainment value. It's not subtle, it's definitely not restrained. And once the plot starts escalating, it becomes harder and harder to believe. But boring, for most of the runtime, not really. That's probably the fairest thing to say about Gray's direction. He doesn't always make the story believable, but he often makes it watchable, very watchable. And with a thriller like this, sometimes that's enough to carry you much further than the logic probably deserves. The frustrating thing about Law-Abiding Citizen is that the screenplay clearly has a strong movie buried inside it. For a while, you can see exactly what that movie is. A grieving father loses faith in the justice system, spends years preparing his response, and then forces the prosecutor, who failed him, to confront the consequences of that decision. That's a solid foundation. More importantly, it gives the movie something to argue about beyond revenge. The early scenes are actually pretty focused. Clyde's motivation makes sense. Nick's position makes sense even if you don't agree with it. Their conflict has a clear moral shape. You understand why both men think they're right. Then the film starts adding machinery, and then even more. At first, Clyde's planning is impressive. He's had 10 years. Fine. You can accept that he has studied the people involved, learned how the system works, built contingency plans, and prepared some very nasty surprises. That's believable enough for a thriller, but the screenplay keeps pushing. Soon Clyde isn't just prepared. He seems prepared for absolutely everything. He knows how people will react. He knows where they'll be. He knows what decisions they'll make. He can apparently manipulate events from inside a prison cell with ridiculous precision. And every time you think the authorities have finally closed one door, the script reveals that Clyde apparently built another door 10 years ago. At some point it stops feeling clever. It starts feeling convenient. That's a big difference. A smart character is fun to watch because you can look back and understand how he got ahead of everyone. An all-knowing character is different. If the answer to every problem is basically, Clyde already thought of that, then eventually there's no real tension left. You know he's going to have another trick. The only question is how absurd that trick is going to be. And the film gets pretty absurd. The technology alone starts stretching credibility. Clyde has access to resources and expertise that seem almost unlimited. The timing of his plans has to be perfect. People have to behave exactly the way he expects. Investigators have to miss certain things until the screenplay is ready for them to find them. That's a lot of luck for a movie that keeps insisting this is all genius. And once you notice that, you start noticing everything else. Legal procedure gets weird. Investigative decisions feel convenient. Characters show up where the plot needs them. Some people make choices that don't feel particularly intelligent, especially considering they know they're dealing with someone who has already demonstrated how far ahead he can plan. You start asking questions the movie really doesn't want you asking. Why would they do that? How did he know that? When did he set this up? How could that possibly work? And the more of those questions pile up, the harder it becomes to stay inside the story. Now, unrealistic movies can absolutely work. That's not the problem. A movie can be completely ridiculous and still be great if it establishes that kind of world from the beginning. If Law-Abiding Citizen had started as a heightened comic book thriller, I think a lot of Clyde's later schemes would be easier to accept. But it doesn't. The opening feels grounded. Ugly home invasion, courtroom frustration, plea bargain. A man losing faith in the legal system. It feels like a dark, serious revenge drama. Then somewhere along the way Clyde becomes this almost impossible criminal mastermind who can apparently weaponize anything around him. That tonal shift is where the movie starts fighting itself. It feels like two different films. The first one is about injustice. The second one is about an unstoppable genius playing games with the entire city. And I don't necessarily dislike either version. I just wish they belonged to the same movie. The early revenge material has this Death Wish-style anger to it, personal, bitter, grounded in one man's loss. Then the story starts drifting closer to Saw, or even the kind of heightened mastermind villain territory where you could compare Clyde to someone like the Joker. That's a completely different energy. Now we're dealing with elaborate traps, psychological games, impossible planning, and a villain who seems to have prepared for every possible move. Again, that can be fun. But the movie still wants you to take the moral argument with complete seriousness. That's where the clash happens. One scene wants you thinking about plea bargaining and institutional failure. The next wants you marveling at how Clyde has somehow arranged another insane kill. Then we're back to a serious conversation about justice. Then something explodes. The film keeps bouncing between those modes without really deciding which one matters more. And eventually the spectacle wins. That's when the screenplay loses some of its edge, because Clyde and Nick talking is actually more interesting than Clyde blowing something up. The courtroom scene has more tension than some of the later action. The prison negotiations have more bite than another complicated revenge device. When these two men are arguing, the movie has something. When it becomes another, guess what Clyde planned this time sequence, the ideas start getting buried. There's also this strange thing with the twists. The movie wants to feel unpredictable, and sometimes it is. You might not know exactly how Clyde is going to strike next, but after a while, the structure becomes pretty easy to read. A character starts feeling safe, probably not safe. Someone begins questioning whether the original deal with Clyde's family was the right call. That conversation probably isn't ending well. The authorities think they've finally figured out the plan. There's obviously another layer, so the details can still surprise you while the rhythm becomes predictable. That's where some of the suspense starts wearing off. Early on, every new death makes the mystery bigger. Later, another death can feel like the movie repeating the same trick with a different mechanism, and that affects the pacing too. I've heard people describe Law-Abiding Citizen as fast-paced, and I get it. A lot happens. There's barely time to settle before the next threat, investigation, negotiation, or attack. For the first half especially, that momentum works really well. You're constantly asking what Clyde is doing and how he's doing it. The mystery keeps the movie moving, but there's another kind of pacing problem underneath that. A movie can have lots of events and still start feeling repetitive. That's what happens later. Once you understand Clyde's basic pattern, the story has to work harder to surprise you, so everything gets bigger. The plans get more complicated, the stakes get larger, the authorities get more desperate, and weirdly the movie can start feeling slower because you already know the rhythm. Another plan, another reaction. Another reveal that Clyde was ahead of them, another scramble to stop him. You're still watching, but the surprise isn't quite the same. By the final third, the screenplay gets especially tangled. There's so much effort going into explaining how Clyde has been operating, what he prepared, what the authorities finally discover, and how they're going to counter him that the clean moral conflict from the beginning is almost gone. And that's a shame, because the movie didn't need to become more complicated to become more interesting. It already had the interesting part, Clyde versus Nick, personal revenge versus legal justice. A prosecutor forced to examine the compromises he built his career on. A victim slowly becoming worse than the system he claims to hate. That's enough. You don't need to keep stacking twists on top of it. Sometimes the script feels like it confuses complication with intelligence. A plan isn't automatically brilliant because it has 12 moving parts. Sometimes 12 moving parts just give the audience 12 opportunities to notice that something doesn't make sense. And Law-Abiding Citizen eventually gives you plenty of those opportunities. The strange thing is, I still enjoy a lot of it. That's what makes the movie so frustrating. Even when I stop believing the mechanics, I still want to see what Clyde does next. Even when the screenplay goes too far, there's enough confidence in the setup to keep dragging you forward. And every now and then, the film returns to that original idea and reminds you how much better it could have been. A line between Clyde and Nick, a moment about the justice system. A reminder that this whole nightmare started because one man decided a conviction was more important than the victim's idea of justice. Then the movie gets back to the gadgets. That's basically the screenplay in miniature. Really strong idea. Some genuinely clever moments, a lot of entertainment, but nowhere near enough restraint. If Clyde had remained brilliant but believable, the movie would have been much scarier. If the revenge had stayed personal a little longer, it would have carried more emotional weight. If the story had trusted the moral conflict instead of constantly escalating the spectacle, it might have delivered on the movie promised in that first act. Instead, Law-Abiding Citizen keeps making itself bigger until it becomes less convincing. And that's the irony. The more elaborate Clyde's plan gets, the less intelligent the movie starts to feel. The ending is where Law-Abiding Citizen loses me the most. Not because I needed Clyde to win. Not because I wanted Nick to lose. It's more that the movie spends so much time building this complicated argument about justice, compromise, revenge, and institutional failure. And then when it finally has to resolve all of that, it kind of takes the easiest exit available. For most of the film, Clyde feels almost impossible to stop. He has another move behind every move. Every time Nick and the authorities think they've figured something out, Clyde is already somewhere ahead of them. Sometimes ridiculously ahead of them, but still, that's the character the movie has created. So when the final confrontation arrives, you expect the ending to match that level of intelligence. Instead, the resolution feels surprisingly simple, almost too simple. And because the film has spent so much time convincing us that Clyde plans for everything, the way he's eventually outmaneuvered creates a strange problem. You don't really think, wow, Nick finally beat him. You think, wait. Clyde didn't think of that. That's not a good question to be asking in the last 10 minutes of a movie built around an obsessive mastermind. The climax is also much more conventional than the rest of the story wants to be. By this point, the movie has raised all kinds of uncomfortable questions. What happens when the justice system prioritizes conviction statistics over moral outcomes? How much compromise is acceptable? When does revenge stop being understandable and become pure destruction? Does Nick actually learn anything from Clyde? Has the system changed at all? Those are the questions sitting there. And instead of really dealing with them, the movie goes for urgency, danger, and the inevitable explosive finish. Literally, it's a little disappointing because the film's best scenes were never really about explosions. They were about arguments, Clyde humiliating legal procedure in the courtroom, Nick trying to justify the deal he made, Clyde explaining that the point isn't simply revenge anymore. Those scenes had tension because the characters were challenging each other. The ending gives us closure, sure, but closure isn't the same thing as resolution. Clyde is stopped. The immediate threat is dealt with. Nick survives the conflict. Okay. But what actually changed? That's where the movie becomes strangely quiet. The justice system that created Clyde's anger is basically still there. The culture of plea bargains is still there. Nick's obsession with winning cases has been challenged, but the movie doesn't spend enough time showing what that really means for him afterward. The institutional problem was huge when the story needed to motivate Clyde. By the end, it almost disappears, and that makes the conclusion feel thematically smaller than the movie that came before it. There's almost this sense that once Clyde is removed, everything can go back to normal. But wasn't the whole point that normal was part of the problem? That's the contradiction. Clyde becomes monstrous. No argument there. He crosses too many lines, kills people who had nothing directly to do with his family, and eventually turns his personal pain into a war against an entire institution. He has to be stopped, but stopping Clyde doesn't automatically prove that the system was right, and I don't think the film knows how to deal with both ideas at the same time, so it chooses one. Clyde went too far. End of story. Except it isn't really the end of the argument. The original plea deal still feels wrong. Nick's reasoning still feels compromised. The system still produced the situation that shattered Clyde's faith in it. The movie never really finds an answer for that, and maybe it doesn't need to give us a neat answer. Some films are better when they leave moral questions open, but there's a difference between deliberately leaving something unresolved and simply moving past it. Here, it feels more like the second one. The movie raises the questions, then gets distracted by the mechanics of stopping Clyde. That's why the ending can feel strangely anticlimactic, even though there's technically a lot happening. The stakes are big, the danger is real, the movie is moving fast, but the interesting part of the story has already been left behind. There's also the final emotional note, which is odd. After spending so much time in this dark, bitter, violent world, the movie suddenly gives us something much softer and more sentimental. I understand what it's trying to do. Nick has been through hell. He has confronted his own choices. He's trying to reconnect with the part of his life that matters outside the courtroom. Conceptually, that makes sense. But tonally, it feels almost too clean, like the movie is trying to reassure us after spending 2 hours making everything messy. And Law-Abiding Citizen is not really a reassuring movie. It's angry, it's cynical. It spends most of its runtime telling us that legal institutions are imperfect, people are morally inconsistent, and revenge can turn a victim into something terrifying. Then suddenly, there's this neat emotional button at the end. It feels like someone wanted the audience to leave the theater feeling a little better. I'm not sure the movie earned that. And I think that ending is a big reason reactions to Law-Abiding Citizen are so divided. Some people absolutely hate this film. They look at the plot holes, Clyde's impossible planning, the exaggerated violence, the legal nonsense, the character decisions, and especially that final stretch, and they see something ridiculous. I get that. If credibility is the thing you need most from a thriller, this movie is going to test your patience badly. There are moments where it asks you to believe things that are very difficult to defend. And the more you think about some of Clyde's plans afterward, the more questions start appearing. But then there's the other side. A lot of people love this movie, and I get that too. Because when Law-Abiding Citizen is working, it's incredibly watchable. It has anger, it has energy, it has a strong central performance from Gerard Butler. It has that satisfying cat-and-mouse structure where you're constantly waiting for the next reveal. It gives you revenge fantasy, courtroom drama, brutal action, moral debate, and this constant question of whether Clyde is completely wrong or just completely out of control. That combination is hard to ignore. It also explains why professional criticism and audience reaction can feel so far apart. You can sit down and dissect the screenplay and find problems everywhere, but movies aren't experienced only as screenplays. Sometimes a movie works because of momentum, because of attitude, because of a performance, because one scene is so entertaining that you forgive the logic until the next scene arrives. Law-Abiding Citizen has a lot of that. Gerard Butler especially does a massive amount of work. Even when Clyde becomes almost impossible to believe, Butler keeps him compelling. You still want to know what he's going to do. You still want to hear what he's going to say. You still kind of enjoy watching everyone else realize they underestimated him. And that brings us back to the biggest strength and biggest problem of the entire movie. Clyde is more interesting than the film's argument against him. That's dangerous because the movie clearly reaches a point where it wants us to understand that he has gone too far. But emotionally, it has already spent so much time making him the smartest, most charismatic, most active person in the story that turning the audience fully against him becomes difficult. Nick is the lawful counterpoint, but he never gets quite the same dramatic weight. The system is supposed to be defended, but the movie itself spends the opening showing us why Clyde stopped believing in it. So by the time the ending arrives, the film is trying to close a moral argument it never really balanced properly, and that's why the resolution feels less satisfying than it should. Still, I wouldn't call Law-Abiding Citizen a failure. Not even close, flawed, definitely. Sometimes ridiculous, absolutely. It becomes too complicated for its own good, pushes Clyde's abilities too far, loses some of its moral focus, and ends in a way that feels safer and more conventional than the setup deserved. But there's too much here that works to dismiss it. The premise is strong. The first half is genuinely gripping. The Clyde-Nick dynamic has real tension. The revenge sequences are memorable. The movie asks questions that are actually worth asking, even if it doesn't know what to do with them later. And maybe that's why people still talk about it. Not because it perfectly explains justice. It doesn't. Not because the plot is airtight. It definitely isn't. But because it taps into something uncomfortable. That feeling that the system can technically work and still feel completely wrong. That revenge can feel emotionally satisfying long after it has stopped being morally defensible. That a victim can become the villain without automatically making everyone who failed him innocent. Those are good ideas. Messy ideas, but good ones. And Law-Abiding Citizen is a messy movie. It starts like a serious justice system thriller, slowly mutates into an outrageous mastermind story, and eventually ends like a much more conventional Hollywood action movie. Somewhere in the middle of all that is a better film, probably a darker one, probably a more restrained one, definitely one with a stronger ending. but the version we got still has enough personality to stick in your head. And honestly, I'd rather watch an ambitious thriller that reaches too far than one that has absolutely nothing to say. Law-abiding Citizen reaches too far. A lot. But even when it falls short, you can still see what it was reaching for.